The Axiron Imperium had ruled the galaxy for over 1,000 years. No race had ever dared to challenge them. Those who tried had been erased from existence, their planets turned to ash, their names lost to time. When the war against Earth began, that Axiron expected it to be over in days. Humanity was young, scattered, and weak. At least, that's what they believed. But humans did not break so easily. The war lasted longer than any Axiron had predicted, stretching into years. The Imperium grew impatient, and so they unleashed their ultimate weapon, the planet killer cannons. In a single, brutal assault, Earth was wiped from the stars. Billions of lives vanished in an instant. The last human colonies were crushed one by one. Their ships, outnumbered and outgunned, were hunted down and destroyed. The Axiron Supreme Warlord stood before the Galactic Council and made his announcement. Humanity is no more. Across the galaxy, alien civilizations accepted this as fact. The once defiant species had been wiped out, just as the Axiron had done to so many others before. No one mourned them. No one questioned it. The war was over. The Imperium had won. And then, weeks later, a signal was detected. It was faint at first, a broken transmission. The Axiron fleet stationed near the ruined remains of Earth received a strange, garbled message. It was in a human language. The officers dismissed it as ghost data, a leftover fragment from a dead civilization. But then the message came again. Stronger this time. Clear. We are still here. The Axiron officers aboard the command dreadnought Vakorath turned to their supreme warlord in confusion. He frowned, his metallic exoskeleton clicking as he processed the information. Impossible. There were no survivors. The human race had been extinguished. There was nothing left. And yet, the signal continued. The Supreme Warlord narrowed his cold, reptilian eyes and ordered a fleet-wide scan. Every sensor in the system activated, sweeping the wreckage of Earth, scanning for any trace of life. For several moments, there was nothing. Then, a single blip appeared on the scanners. The crew stared at their screens, their bodies tensing in disbelief. The lone warship, moving at impossible speed, entering the system from the void of space. Its hull was dark, almost invisible, reflecting no light. No known registry, no identification codes, just one name, etched into its surface in deep, battle-worn scars. ASS Vengeance. The bridge fell into stunned silence. The Supreme Warlord leaned forward, staring at the image on the screen. His voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable weight of command. Open a channel. A few seconds later, the transmission connected. The screen flickered, static crackling before stabilizing. And there, standing on the bridge of the human warship, was a man, Captain Darius Kane. His face was lined with scars, his uniform battered but still bearing the insignia of Earth's fallen fleet. His eyes, cold, sharp, filled with something that Axiron had never seen before. A storm, a rage that had no end. Kane tilted his head slightly, as if examining the Supreme Warlord like a predator sizing up his prey. Then he spoke. "You should have killed us all." For the first time in centuries, the Supreme Warlord felt something he had forgotten. Doubt. The officers around him erupted into laughter, their exoskeletal bodies clicking in amusement. One ship, against the entire might of the Axiron Imperium. The very idea was absurd. The Supreme Warlord let the moment stretch before responding. "Human," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "your species is dead. Your planet is dust. Do you truly believe a single ship can challenge us?" Kane didn't flinch. "Watch me." And then, the vengeance vanished. Every alarm on the Axiron command bridge blared at once. The officers scrambled to regain visual, but there was nothing. No heat signature. No energy readings. It was as if the ship had never been there. A cloaking system. Impossible. The Axiron Imperium had the most advanced detection technology in the galaxy. No ship should have been able to disappear so completely. But before they could react, before the Supreme Warlord could issue an order, boom! The Vakorev shook violently. A massive explosion rocked its side, sending flames and debris spiraling into space. A second explosion followed, then a third. The fleet fell into chaos. "We're under attack," an officer screamed. "Where is the enemy?" Another shouted. The Supreme Warlord gritted his teeth, his mind racing. How? How was this happening? Then, out of nowhere, a whisper crackled through the ship's speakers, a voice laced with cold fury. Kane's voice. "This is for Earth." Before anyone could respond, another Xiron battleship exploded. The Vengeance wasn't just attacking. It was hunting them. One by one, the Xiron ships fell, their defenses useless against an enemy they couldn't see. The fleet was in full panic mode. They'd fired blindly into the void, hoping to hit something, anything. But their weapons struck only empty space. The Vengeance was moving too fast, striking with precision, then vanishing before they could counter. The Supreme Warlord gripped his throne, his claws digging into the armrests. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated humanity. Another explosion. Another battleship gone. His officers turned to him, desperate, their arrogance replaced with fear. For the first time in galactic history, a Xiron fleet was losing a battle. Not to an armada, not to an empire, to one single human warship. The Supreme Warlord's jaw tightened. He would not allow this humiliation to continue. "Summon the Grand Fleet," he commanded. Across the system, hyperspace portals began to open. Hundreds of Tyron warships poured in, each one more massive than the last. Their weapons locked onto the Vengeance's last known location. A firestorm of plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes erupted toward it, enough firepower to wipe out a moon. For a long moment, there was only silence. No movement, no counterattack. The Supreme Warlord allowed himself a cold smirk. It was over. No ship, no matter how advanced, could survive an onslaught like that. But then, a single message appeared on his screen. A transmission. From the Vengeance. With a trembling claw, the Supreme Warlord accepted the call. Kane's face appeared once more, his expression unchanged. "You should have sent more." And then, the real battle began. The Tyron Grand Fleet filled the space around the ruined remains of Earth, their warships stretching across the void like a wall of steel and fire. Hundreds of battleships, dreadnoughts, and cruisers had arrived in response to a single enemy, the HSS Vengeance. The Supreme Warlord sat on the command bridge of the Vakorev, watching as his fleet locked weapons onto the human warship's last known position. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then the order came. Fire everything. A storm of plasma cannons and antimatter torpedoes tore through the darkness, enough firepower to obliterate an entire planet. The Xiron officers watched with satisfaction as the energy blasts crashed into their target, engulfing it in a blinding explosion. For a moment, it looked as if the human warship had finally been destroyed. But then the scanners flickered. A shadow moved inside the explosion. A shape emerged from the fire. The Vengeance had not been destroyed. It had not even been scratched. The ship twisted through the barrage with impossible speed, dodging shots that should have been unavoidable. Plasma bolts streaked past it. Torpedoes detonated harmlessly in its wake. The ship's black hull shimmered, shifting like liquid metal, as if adapting to the energy around it. Inside the bridge of the Vengeance, Captain Darius Kane stood firm, his hand steady on the controls. The ship's experimental cloaking drive hummed, bending light and radiation around them, making them nearly impossible to lock onto. They weren't just invisible. They were untouchable. A Xiron battleship tried to adjust its aim, but before it could react, the Vengeance struck first. A beam of energy lanced out from its underbelly, slicing through the battleship's armor like paper. The Xiron vessel erupted in a fireball, its crew screaming as they were pulled into the vacuum of space. The rest of the fleet scrambled to adjust, their formation breaking apart as panic set in. The Supreme Warlord's claws tightened. "Regain formation," he barked. "Target their engines. Do not let them escape." His fleet obeyed. Hundreds of targeting systems locked onto the Vengeance at once, attempting to track its erratic movements. But it was moving too fast, dodging and weaving between ships like a ghost. Then, without warning, the ship vanished. The Axiron officers hesitated, their hands hovering over their controls. Where had it gone? Suddenly, alarms blared across the fleet. "They're inside our formation," an officer screamed. The Vengeance had reappeared directly in the center of the fleet, surrounded on all sides by enemy warships. But instead of being trapped, it attacked with surgical precision. Drones poured out of its hull, sleek, AI-controlled machines armed with plasma blades and railguns. They moved with terrifying speed, swarming the Axiron ships like a plague. One drone lashed onto a destroyer's hull and drilled inside, cutting through bulkheads and tearing apart the engine core. Another drone slipped into the hangar of a Axiron carrier, where it hacked into the ship's control systems, forcing it to turn its weapons on its own fleet. The Supreme Warlord watched in horror as one of his own battleships was struck by friendly fire, its shields failing under the unexpected assault. "How?" he growled, his mind racing. "How are they doing this?" Kane's voice came through the ship's speakers, cold and unrelenting. "You don't understand us, do you?" The Supreme Warlord's eyes widened. "You think numbers make you strong," Kane continued. "You think technology makes you invincible. But war isn't just about weapons. It's about the will to fight." Another explosion rocked the Axiron fleet. Another battleship fell. The Vengeance zipped through the chaos, a predator among prey. Kane's crew worked in perfect synchronization, every maneuver calculated, every strike devastating. A Axiron dreadnought, 20 times the size of the human warship, attempted to intercept. It unleashed a concentrated energy pulse, enough to vaporize any known ship. But Kane had been waiting for this. He pushed a command into his console. The Vengeance split apart. Not physically, but visually. Its cloaking system created multiple copies of itself, scattering ghost images across the battlefield. The dreadnought's massive cannon fired, but at the wrong target. The real Vengeance swooped underneath, unleashing a devastating plasma torpedo straight into the dreadnought's core. The massive warship detonated in a blinding explosion. The Axiron fleet was crumbling. More and more ships fell, unable to defend themselves against a foe they couldn't predict. The Vengeance was rewriting the rules of battle. It wasn't fighting like a fleet. It was fighting like a hunter, choosing its kills carefully, striking with maximum impact. For the first time in his life, the Supreme Warlord felt fear. "We have to regroup," one of his officers stammered. "We need to retreat." The Supreme Warlord slammed his fist onto his throne, his rage boiling over. "No, we do not retreat from a single ship." But even as he spoke, he saw it. The Vengeance had changed course. It wasn't just picking off ships anymore. It was coming straight for him. The Vakoreth, the Axiron command dreadnought, the heart of the fleet. Kane wasn't just attacking. He was coming for the leader. The ship roared through the battlefield. Unstoppable, relentless, deadly. The Supreme Warlord's mind raced. He had fought in 1,000 battles. He had crushed entire civilizations. He had never lost. But this time, he might. Kane's voice rang through the fleet once more. "This is for Earth." And then the Vengeance opened fire. The war should have been over. Humanity was supposed to be extinct. The Supreme Warlord had declared it himself, standing before the Axiron High Command, his voice echoing through the grand halls of their empire. The galaxy had accepted it as truth. Planets that had once feared human resistance breathed easier. Governments that had once hesitated to bow to the Axiron Imperium had done so without question. The war was won. The galaxy belonged to the Axiron. And yet, here they were, watching the impossible unfold. A single human warship, one ship, was tearing through the might of the Imperium's grand fleet. The HSS Vengeance was no ordinary vessel. It moved like a phantom, striking where it pleased, disappearing before anyone could counter. Tyron ships burned, dreadnoughts fell. Entire battle formations shattered as the Vengeance carved its way through the heart of the fleet. The news spread like wildfire. Across the galaxy, encrypted transmissions carried the impossible tale. Hidden resistance groups, thought long defeated, intercepted the signals and whispered among themselves. The humans live. Former allies of Earth, long since conquered or forced into submission, paused and listened. One ship is fighting back. Even those who had stood against humanity in the past found themselves unable to look away. Because this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a message, and the entire galaxy was listening. In the Tyron capital, the High Command watched the battle unfold through holographic displays, their expressions dark with fury and disbelief. The Supreme Warlord had not contacted them yet, which meant only one thing: he was losing. It was unacceptable. Never before had a battle against a lesser race lasted this long. Never before had the mighty Xiron fleet been made to look weak. The Chancellor of the High Command, a cold and calculating strategist named Vexal, observed the reports in silence. Around him, Xiron officials argued, their voices sharp with panic. Some demanded reinforcements. Others insisted it was an anomaly, just one ship, an irritation, not a real threat. Vexal disagreed. He tapped his long, clawed fingers against the table, eyes narrowing as he analyzed the battle data. Something about this warship was different. It wasn't just advanced. It was adaptive. It was moving in ways that should have been impossible, reacting faster than their ships could adjust. It had technology the Xiron Imperium had never seen before. This was not a remnant of humanity's old fleet. This was something new. Vexal stood and spoke with a voice that silenced the room. "Deploy the Void Hunters." Gasps filled the chamber. The Void Hunters were legendary. A secret fleet, hidden deep in the blackest parts of space, existing only in whispers and fear. They were not ordinary ships. They were designed to hunt the unkillable. Cloaking technology, superior firepower, and a ruthlessness that made even the Xiron's own soldiers uneasy. They had only been used twice in the history of the Imperium. Both times, entire civilizations had been erased. If the Vengeance had defied the laws of war, then the Void Hunters would break it. Orders were sent. Across the galaxy, dark warships that had never been seen by outsiders powered up their engines, slipping from the shadows of dead planets and abandoned star systems. The hunt had begun. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the Vengeance was still moving, still fighting. But Captain Darius Kane knew the battle was changing. His crew had pushed the Xiron fleet to the edge of collapse, but the enemy was adapting. More ships were arriving, heavier, faster, deadlier. The Supreme Warlord, no matter how furious, was no fool. He was calling in every resource he had. Kane stood on the bridge, watching the data scroll across his screen. His hands tightened into fists. He knew what was coming, and yet he did not back down. "Status?" he asked, his voice calm. The ship's eye, a cold and precise entity named Ghost, responded immediately. "Our shields are at 74%, weapons at full capacity, enemy reinforcements arriving in 3 minutes. Probability of survival is decreasing." Kane exhaled slowly. Let them come. Outside, the Xiron fleet reformed, adjusting to the Vengeance's hit-and-run tactics. No longer were they chasing the human warship in chaotic panic. Now they were working together, creating barriers, cutting off escape routes. Kane watched the shifting battle lines and knew their tactics were changing. But they still didn't understand what they were fighting. A sharp ping sounded across the bridge. Another transmission was coming in, but not from the Xiron. Kane's brow furrowed. He tapped the controls, allowing the encrypted message to appear. A voice came through. "Captain Kane, This is Commander Ralzek of the Free Avarian Republic. We've been monitoring your fight. We thought your people were gone. But if you are here, if you are still fighting, then perhaps we were wrong to give up. Kane's grip on the console tightened. The Avarians had been Earth's allies once, long before the Xiron wiped them out as well. If they were reaching out now, it meant only one thing: hope. The transmission continued. The galaxy believes that Xiron cannot be challenged. You are proving them wrong. If you can survive this battle, you won't be fighting alone for long. Kane let the words sink in. His crew exchanged glances, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. Then Kane smiled. Then let's make sure we survive. The Xiron fleet closed in, their warships forming a deadly blockade around the Vengeance. Energy cannons powered up, missiles locked on. The Supreme Warlord's voice boomed across the open channel, filled with rage. You have nowhere to run, human. Surrender, and I will grant you a quick death. Kane laughed softly, shaking his head. Surrender, he echoed. We don't know the meaning of the word. And then, the Vengeance vanished. The Supreme Warlord barely had time to react before the first of his ships exploded. The battle was far from over. And now, the entire galaxy was watching. The Vengeance floated in the silent void, hidden beneath its cloaking field, its hull scarred from the brutal battle it had just survived. The ship had struck the Xiron fleet, harder than anyone thought possible. But Captain Darius Kane knew this war was far from over. The Xiron were wounded, but they weren't dead. Not yet. Kane stood on the bridge, staring at the holographic battle map. Ghost, the ship's AI, projected a series of calculations, probabilities flashing across the screen. The enemy was regrouping. Their reinforcements were closing in, and the Vengeance was alone. No backup, no reinforcements, no escape. Kane exhaled, forcing himself to focus. There had to be a way. They had already achieved the impossible by surviving this long. Now they needed to push further. They needed to end this. The crew around him was battered but determined. They had seen their friends die, watched entire enemy fleets burn, and yet they were still here, still fighting. Options? Kane asked, his voice calm. Ghost's response was immediate. Based on current fleet positions, escape probability is less than 12%. Engaging in direct combat results in complete annihilation within 3 minutes. Kane smirked. Not ideal. His weapons officer, Lieutenant Rourke, clenched his jaw. We can't fight them head-on, Captain. But we don't have to. Kane turned to him. Go on. Rourke pointed to the map, zooming in on a distant point in space, a hidden Xiron command station. That's their relay hub. Every order, every fleet movement, it all goes through there. If we hit it, we throw their entire operation into chaos. Kane's eyes narrowed. A gambit. A single strike to disrupt that Xiron war machine. A risk. But if it worked, they could cripple the enemy. Ghost, Kane said. What happens if we take out that station? Ghost's processors whirred. Xiron fleet coordination would collapse for an estimated 27 minutes. Their reinforcement response would be significantly delayed. That's enough time, Kane murmured. Enough time for the resistance to strike. Enough time to turn the tide. His crew was already moving. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about victory. The Vengeance engaged its silent drive, slipping through the battlefield like a ghost, weaving through the wreckage of fallen ships. The Xiron were still scanning for them, firing blindly into empty space, desperate to destroy the one human warship that refused to die. But they were looking in the wrong places. Kane's hands tightened on the controls as the station came into view. It was massive. A fortress in space, bristling with weapons, guarded by a dozen battleships. A direct assault would be suicide. But Kane had never been one for direct assaults. Ghost, he said, give me every weak point in that station. I need something, anything, that can bring it down fast. Ghost's reply came in seconds. The station's main reactor is heavily shielded, but there is a weakness. The cooling vents. A precise strike could trigger a chain reaction. Kane's mind raced. It was a one-shot chance. If they missed, they would be swarmed. Work spoke up, his voice grim. "We get one shot at this, sir." Kane nodded. "Then we make it count." The Vengeance powered up its weapons. The Tyron defenders hadn't spotted them yet. They had the element of surprise. Kane exhaled. Now or never. Fire. The plasma cannons roared, streaks of blue energy cutting through the void. The first strike hit dead center, tearing through the vent systems. The second pierced the core. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the station erupted. Fire and debris ripped outward as the cooling vents overloaded, triggering a catastrophic meltdown. The Axiron battleships scrambled, their formations breaking apart in confusion. Their command center, gone in an instant. Kane didn't wait to see the aftermath. "Get us out of here. Now." The Vengeance vanished back into the void, leaving behind only wreckage and chaos. As they slipped away, Ghost's voice came through. "Enemy fleet coordination is collapsing. Estimated disruption, 32 minutes. Kane smiled. That's more than enough. The Resistance had its chance. Now, the real battle could begin. The Vengeance had vanished, but the war was far from over. The Axiron fleet hung in the void, scanning, searching, their weapons locked onto empty space. The Supreme Warlord sat rigid on his throne, claws digging into the armrests. He had never been so humiliated. A single human warship had defied him, slaughtered his fleet, and then vanished like a ghost. His fury was a burning sun inside him, but fury alone would not win this battle. "Find them," he growled. His officers scrambled, scanning every frequency, tracking every distortion. There was no trace of the Vengeance. The ship's cloaking system was beyond anything they had ever encountered. It wasn't just invisible. It was untouchable. For several tense moments, silence stretched across the battlefield. The remaining Tyron warships floated like predators waiting for movement. They weren't retreating. They refused to run from one ship. But their confidence was starting to crack. The fleet had never lost before. And now they were afraid. Then, without warning, the attack came. The first explosion tore through the side of a Axiron battleship, splitting it in two. Fire and debris scattered into space as alarms blared across the fleet. Before anyone could react, another ship was hit, a direct plasma strike to its engine core. The Vengeance had returned, but it was everywhere at once. The ship's cloaking technology wasn't just hiding it, it was projecting false signals, creating phantom images across the battlefield. Xiron gunners fired wildly at empty space, wasting precious shots. The Supreme Warlord snarled as another of his ships fell to a perfect ambush. They weren't just being hunted. They were being humiliated. On the bridge of the Vengeance, Captain Darius Kane watched the enemies panic with cold precision. His crew moved like clockwork, every maneuver calculated, every shot devastating. The Axiron had ruled through fear. Now, they were tasting it themselves. Ghost, the ship's AI, spoke in its calm, detached voice. Xiron fleet cohesion is deteriorating. They are reacting instead of strategizing. Kane allowed himself a small smirk. Good. Let's give them more to panic about. He pressed a command. The Vengeance split again, its cloaking system scattering a dozen ghost signals across the enemy's radar. To the Tyron, it looked like an entire fleet of human warships had arrived. The Supreme Warlord's eyes widened. Impossible. There was only one ship. The Axiron officers hesitated, their voices rising in confusion. Some suggested retreat. Others insisted it was an illusion. But the fear had taken hold. They had never faced an enemy like this. And then, a new signal entered the battlefield. Kane's eyes flicked to his display. His stomach tightened. The Void Hunters had arrived. Black, Angular warships emerged from the darkness. Chiron vessels unlike any the Vengeance had faced before. They made no sound. Their energy signatures barely registered. They were the Chiron's last resort, designed for one purpose: to kill the unkillable. The battlefield shifted. The hunted had become the hunters. Kane knew they had seconds, only seconds, before the Void Hunters locked onto their real position. "Brace," he ordered. The first strike came in an instant. A dark energy beam ripped through space, narrowly missing the Vengeance as it veered to the side. The ship shuddered under the sheer force of the blast. These ships were faster, more precise. They weren't panicking. The battle had changed. Ghost's voice cut through the chaos. Enemy fleet adapting. Probability of survival decreasing. Kane gritted his teeth. This was it. The real fight. The Void Hunters moved with terrifying speed, their weapons slicing through the void with deadly accuracy. The Vengeance dodged, weaved, fired back, but these enemies weren't like the others. They weren't afraid. They were designed for this. A blast struck the Vengeance's left wing, sending sparks across the bridge. Shields flickered, damage reports flooded in. The ship could take hits, but not forever. For the first time since the battle began, Kane felt a sliver of doubt. Then his comms lit up. "This is Commander Ralzek of the Free Avarian Republic. We are entering the battle." Kane's eyes widened. His display flashed as new ships jumped into the fight. Sleek, golden-hulled Avarian warships, their weapons locked onto the Chiron fleet. The Supreme Warlord snarled in disbelief. The Avarians were supposed to be broken, conquered, but here they were, fighting back. And they weren't alone. More signals appeared. Dozens, hundreds. A fleet of ships from across the galaxy. Hidden resistance groups. Former allies of humanity. Warriors who had once feared the Chiron, but now saw a chance to fight back. They had seen the battle. They had seen what the Vengeance had done. And now, they had made their choice. Kane exhaled slowly, his grip tightening. The tide had turned. The battle wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about victory. The battlefield was chaos. Explosions erupted in the void as warships clashed in a fight that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The once invincible Chiron fleet was crumbling, their formation shattered by the unexpected arrival of the Resistance. On the bridge of the Vengeance, Captain Darius Kane stood at the center of it all. His eyes locked onto the battle display. The numbers were shifting. What had once been a hopeless last stand was turning into something else. A victory. A real victory. The Chiron Imperium had never faced an enemy like this. Not just humanity. Not just one ship. But a galaxy that had been pushed too far. A galaxy that had been ruled by fear for too long. And now fear was turning against the Chiron. For the first time in history, they were the ones running. The Supreme Warlord watched from his flagship, his claws digging into the metal throne. His eyes burned with hatred as he saw his fleet failing. His empire had never lost. The Chiron were the rulers of the stars, the unstoppable force. And yet here it was. A single human ship had started this. And now, the galaxy had followed. He refused to accept it. His voice boomed across the command bridge. "Deploy all remaining forces. I want that human ship destroyed." But it was too late. The Chiron formations were breaking. The resistance forces were overwhelming them, pushing forward, unstoppable now. One by one, Chiron warships fell. Dreadnoughts, cruisers, entire battle stations erased in fire. The fleet that had ruled for centuries was coming apart at the seams. Kane saw the shift. He could feel it. His crew was bruised, exhausted, battered, but their spirits were burning brighter than ever. They had done the impossible. The Chiron were losing. Then, a new warning flashed on Kane's screen. The Supreme Warlord's flagship was powering up something massive. Ghost's voice came through, cold and urgent. Enemy flagship is charging its main weapon. Estimated output, planetary destruction level. Kane's stomach tightened. The Supreme Warlord was going to destroy everything. Not just the Vengeance, not just the Resistance fleet, but the entire battlefield. If he couldn't win, he would make sure no one survived. Kane's mind raced. They had seconds to act. He turned to his weapons officer. Target their core. Full power. The officer hesitated. Sir, that ship is too big. We don't have the firepower to. We don't need to destroy it, Kane cut in. His voice was steady. We just need to stop it. For a long second, the bridge was silent. Then, firing. The Vengeance unleashed everything it had. Missiles, plasma rounds, ion beams, all of it aimed at one single point, the core of the enemy flagship. The Resistance ships followed, focusing their fire onto the same target. The Supreme Warlord's ship trembled under the assault. The energy core flickered, unstable. And then, it detonated. The explosion ripped through the flagship in a massive chain reaction. The Supreme Warlord's last, desperate attack was cut off as fire consumed his throne room. His final roar of fury was lost as his ship, the heart of the HFY Imperium, was erased from existence. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the HFY fleet broke completely. Their leader was gone. Their strongest warship destroyed. The surviving HFY vessels turned and ran, retreating into the darkness of space. The unthinkable had happened. The HFY Imperium had fallen. The Resistance fleet remained, battered but victorious. Across the comm channels, voices of disbelief turned to cheers. Across the galaxy, news of the HFY's defeat spread like wildfire. Planets that had lived in fear for generations rebelled all at once. The empire that had ruled the stars with an iron grip was no more. On the bridge of the Vengeance, Kane closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. It was over. They had won. His crew was silent, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Many had fought knowing they would probably die. And yet, they were still standing. Kane turned to the comms officer. Open a channel to all ships. A second later, his voice echoed across the fleet. To all those who fought with us today, you have done more than win a battle. You have changed the future of the galaxy. The HFY are finished. Their reign of terror is over. But our work is not done. There are still worlds to free. There are still scars to heal. Today, we reclaim the stars. A roar of cheers erupted across the fleet. The war wasn't over, but the HFY Imperium was. And for the first time in a long, long time, humanity had hope.